Good morning, colleagues. Thank you, Prof. Matoti, Dr. Malebu, colleagues across the higher education sector, and all protocol observed. It's for me an honor and privilege to introduce to you our guest speaker for this session, for this very last session of our conference today, Professor Yunus Ballim. As you may have seen from the title of his presentation, that Prof. Ballim will be talking to this topic on educating our students in a university that cares about their learning. What a relevant topic at this point in time of our higher education sector. Without much ado, Prof, let me share with you a brief, sort of an abbreviation of Prof. Ballim's biography. He's currently a professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Witwatersrand. He was the Vice-Chancellor of Sol Plaatje University. Prof. Ballim became a lecturer in construction materials in 1992, and then became an associate professor in construction materials in 1999. And later he was the head of School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. His research is in civil engineering material science with a focus on cement-based materials. Prof. Ballim has been appointed as chair of the review reference group for the 2020 review of the NRF, and as the chair of the ministerial task team that is responsible for the review of the operation of NEFSAS. Ladies and gentlemen, join me this morning in presenting to you Professor Yunus Ballim. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Firstly, thank you to Dr. Malebu, Professor Matoti, and Ms. Maimane for that wonderfully brief introduction. The rest is quite boring. Thank you. I need to share my screen, so just bear with me for a minute. I think it's this one. I hope that you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
The pointer going. Okay. You can. Excellent. Thank you. So, colleagues, first of all, Altasa is an organization that I think we need to take very seriously in South Africa. And Altasa has been doing some good work over the past few years that I've been associated or watching from the periphery. I think the whole idea about the way in which we approach teaching and learning in South Africa is fairly underdeveloped. And we need to think quite carefully about what it is that we do and the way in which we engage with our students. You'll have heard from the introduction that I was the Vice-Chancellor at Sol Plaatje University. But actually, I was also the very first employee of Sol Plaatje University, the only one at the time. My office was little more than a cardboard box in the middle of the road in Kimberley. I'm exaggerating. But that's where the university started. And one of the things that I did when we started the university was I thought about the possibility of doing some revolutionary things. You'll also have heard that I'm a civil engineer. I'm not an educationist. And indeed, one of the comments, if not criticisms, that people have leveled at me is, what was the academic basis? What was the research basis for you to decide the things that you decided upon when you started Sol Plaatje University? And I have to say, it's about if you say to them left, right, they'll say, well, it was obvious. And that's part of the problem, is sort of getting a sense of what is it, what are the values that guide the sort of things that you want to do. And what I hope I'll do this morning in the next 40 minutes or so is guide you through some of the issues that that we considered, the way in which we made some of the decisions that we made, but importantly, a sense of an institution that was experimenting and trying to respond to a particular problem. And just to give you a sense of what I'm going to talk about, I do want to spend just a moment characterizing the problem that sort of focused our minds. I'm going to talk a little bit about institutional cultures because I think it is important. And Sol Plaatje University, starting at Sol Plaatje University, offered the opportunity for constructing an institutional culture in ways that we didn't have, that other universities may not have had an opportunity to do. Indeed, I've always said that Sol Plaatje University started without the historical baggage of previously advantaged, previously disadvantaged. But what it also meant was a serious challenge. And that was when we have to account for failures in the future, the university cannot resort to its history and say, well, you know, we were previously advantaged and therefore racism remains a feature of our campus, or vice versa. Those were not opportunities of excuse for us. I'll talk a little bit about curriculum development that supports learning and the way in which we sort of constructed curricula. Sort of a few about what it means to construct infrastructure that supports learning at a university. So in my mind, this really is the nub of the problem. And it has two particular features. Why is it that after so many years and such a large proportion of transformation that has happened at our universities, why is it that there's a persistent overrepresentation of poor and Black students in the qualification completion rates? It doesn't matter which university you go to, white and Indian students are in the upper end of the graduation class, or in the pass rates. African and colored students show a higher proportion of dropouts. We live in a country where race still overlaps very strongly with class. So the statements I'm making, although I'm referring to racial, is really a statement about class. You know, the decision about whether a student from a rural or township area will get into a top university, a UFS or a Free State, or maybe even a CUT or a Wits, is actually made in grade 1, not in matric. There's a large, overwhelming social context in the way in which our students engage with schooling that has a sense and an influence on the way in which they get admitted into universities. The second part of my concern is that for those who do graduate, poor and Black students are underrepresented in the upper academic performance levels. They're the students who get 50 and 60%. They are not likely to be in the group that gets awards. But more importantly, they are not likely to be the group that passes well enough to get into our postgraduate programs. And if we are concerned about the future of the academic cohort at our universities, this is the second question that we really have to ask ourselves. What is it that keeps Black students, poor students away from the upper levels of qualification? Now, of course, I take for granted that intellectual ability can't be determined by race, class, geography, gender, and those sorts of things. And so if that is our starting assumption, then what is it about the way in which we construct our institutions, the way in which we engage with the learning of our students, that gives us these skewed patterns of academic performance at our universities? I don't know the answer, and I don't pretend to, but I do think it's a question that we need to engage with more intelligently and in far greater depth. But it's also a question that requires courage. And some of the issues I'll raise are, I think, pointing to the problem, but I'll also sort of ask for more courageous and self-analysis. And I don't think we've been doing that sufficiently. I want to talk a little bit about issues of institutional culture. And by institutional culture, I'm not talking about the sort of the rules, the stuff that that is written in the documents and so on. I'm talking about the unwritten network of habits, behaviors, social patterns that determine the way in which people interact with each other at a university. One of the things that struck me as unusual, remember, I think I'm the first dark-skinned person to be employed as an academic in the Faculty of Engineering at Wits University. Sort of, you know, we sometimes forget how recently we've arrived at civilization sometimes. But one of the things that I got involved in sort of student issues and teaching and learning issues, even in the early years of my life as an academic. I came from industry and joined the university. Was people would say, that's not the way we do it. That's not how Wits does it. And I'd say, well, where does that rule come from? Oh, no, it's not the way we do it. And of course, you'll hear similar stories at other universities. And it's that the way we do it that I'm referring to as the institutional culture. Now, for me, institutional culture is constructed. It's not something that is happen chance. It can be directed. And the institutional culture bleeds from the wall of the institution. I'm the founding president of the African Materials Research Society. So I spent some time on university campuses around the continent. And it's actually not that difficult when you walk into a university to get a feel for what does this university stand for. And it's institutional culture that has an influence on who we hear, whose voices we hear, and whose voices we are deaf to. I'm going to speak about the pathologies in our institutional culture, and I'm going to use that term as a medical term, an illness that requires time and attention and directed attention in order to cure. But I'm not always convinced that we suitably acknowledge the learning context and epistemology with which our students arrive. Some of you may be aware that I've challenged the notion of epistemological access. I've struggled with that concept. And the only way that I can find reason and meaning in the phrase is if I think of it as a culturally arrogant statement. All human beings arrive with an epistemology. You may not agree with their epistemology, but they all arrive with one. They can all explain the observable world that they live in. And that's epistemology. How do you know that you know? Now, there are some questions, of course, that we never bother with. We do because the empirical evidence says it's a good idea to do it. So there are many people in the room at the moment, I'm assuming I can't see you, including myself, who could not explain the functional relationship between eating and remaining alive. But on the other hand, the empirical evidence is if I don't eat, I'll die. So it's a good idea to eat, even if you don't know why you're eating. In other words, epistemologically, you don't know how you know that you should eat, except that there's evidence that if I don't eat, I'll die. So, and such is the nature of the way in which we construct our own epistemologies. Some of it is based on foundational understanding, but a lot of it, in fact, most of what we do because other people have told us it's a good idea to do it. For 400 years, the Greeks and the Romans, making their enormous contributions to modern civilization, mathematics, philosophy, believed that lightning was caused because the gods were having an argument. That's it, it's fine. That's your epistemology. That's the way in which you explain the observable universe. But to say that our students arrive without an epistemology is silly. Because what you're really saying is our students need to get access to my epistemology. If I'm teaching a course in sociology or anthropology, and in front of me is a class of African, Chinese, and Indian students, and I only speak English. My class knows 6 words for uncle, 2 words for grandmother. English knows only 1 word for those relationships. English uses the same pronoun for an adult as they do for a child. You try in an African home or an Indian home to say you to your grandmother and see whether you can reach the kitchen door quickly enough before you get a slap on your head. If you don't understand these sorts of contexts of social relations and family relations, you actually aren't able to teach me anthropology. The lecturer is disadvantaged. The lecturer must go for a bridging course, not the students. And I'm not sure that we always acknowledge that. I don't think we always acknowledge different ways of knowing. Our purpose is to educate our students, not to captivate them. We don't want to captivate our students into a particular way of knowing. I use the example of family connectedness. But in mathematics, those of you who come from that branch of learning, complex number theory. Complex number theory is based on the ridiculous assumption that the square root of -1 exists. Now, to everything that you've been taught about mathematics, there's no number which, if you multiply it by itself, will give you -1. But there's a world of a way of knowing numbers where if you don't acknowledge it, there are certain problems that you cannot solve. In fact, quantum mechanics relies on complex number theory. So there are worlds in which you have to step out of the normal way in which you understand concepts in order to be able to solve problems that are otherwise insoluble. And we accept that in some disciplines, but we won't accept another way of knowing in the heads of our students. My third point is that I'm not sure that we always appreciate that our students are interested in the world of ideas rather than a purely utilitarian view of education. And I'm going to use an example in this case. When I was an undergraduate at Wits, remember we weren't allowed to live in residences, we had to go back to townships every day and so on. I was envious of my fellow white students who lived in residence because they would come and say, oh, on the weekend, Professor so-and-so gave us a lecture on astronomy or physics or politics or something. And these lectures happened in the residences on a weekend or on a Thursday evening. All the hall coordinators were academics. When our residences became entirely black, when all the students, and that happened over a very short period, black students arrived and white students stopped living in the residences. Academics stopped being hall coordinators. Almost all our hall coordinators became administrative staff. And no academic lectures happened at the residences anymore. In fact, at the time that I became the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Wits, one of the things we were doing was we were shutting down pubs in the residences. And the idea that black students are not really interested in the world of ideas, I think is something that we have to interrogate in the way in which we engage with our students. It seems to me that our view is that black students are at our university simply to get a job. And they're not really interested in the world of ideas. I've made the point about the changing character of residences. Residences are essentially learning spaces, and we have to treat them as that. In secondary consideration, they are places to sleep and eat. But primarily, they are residence spaces, learning spaces. And I think also we have to think about the way in which we develop curriculum, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I'm also worried about the assessment culture that I find at a university. It seems to me that if you teach English 1, 2, and 3, it is possible, it should be possible to teach Hamlet in English 1, 2, and 3. It should be possible to set exactly the same question in your final exam in English 1, 2, and 3. But the answer that gets you 100% in first year will get you 50% in second year and a failing mark in third year. In other words, 100% is not what I know. 100% is what a good student in my class should know. What I know brings 40 years of experience, and that's silly to expect our students to be able to do that. I was making this argument in a discussion at a university on assessment, and one of the academics got up and said, if a student knows what I know, that student will only get 75%. I think sometimes we believe that our identity is woven around the marks that we give our students. If I give a student 100%, that says that I'm incompetent as a lecturer. I really do think we need to engage with what it means to assess. I've got into the habit where when I start marking an exam, I say to myself, this student has 100%. Why should I give the student less? I find too many of my academic colleagues, when they look at the exam script, they say, this student has 0. What reason do I have for giving the student more than 0? And it seems to me that that's a philosophical shift in the way in which you approach your marking and assessment. I also worry that sometimes we don't know how to read our students' work. And that comes from my argument earlier about not being open to different ways of knowing. I think that as we develop curriculum at our universities, we need to think carefully about integrating 4 areas that happen separately, but we don't always integrate them. They happen separately for administrative reasons, but intellectually we should actually account for the coherence between the admissions policy. Why are we admitting a particular type of student? On what basis do we believe that this student is suitably prepared to meet the intellectual challenges of my course or my academic program? How do we structure the curriculum to respond to that student's learning? We admitted the students. How do we respond to that student's learning needs? Through curriculum structure, but more importantly, through its coherence. How do we progressively develop the competence of our students as the curriculum progresses? What pedagogical instruments do we need to support that curriculum that we've developed? Sometimes we swap these processes. We say, I'm going to stand in front of a class and teach. Now, what do I need to teach? That's the wrong way around. First, understand what learning competence you want to develop in your students, and then design the pedagogy to support that. And then lastly, this thing called exit standards. And I put it in inverted commas because, of course, standards is a loaded word. But I do think that we need to think a bit carefully about how we experience and understand these things called standards. And how do individual academics, when they first arrive at your institution, get to know what the expectations are of the exit level of performance of the students? To most of us, it happens really by osmosis. You think, well, what was needed of me? Well, that's what I'm going to expect from my students. I've met academics who go into depression if more than 60% of the class passes their course. Because, oh dear, I've let the standards drop, 70% of students passed. Because they feel that a low pass rate is an indicator of a good quality program or a good quality course, when actually most often it's an indicator of the poverty of your teaching. I've met academics, not in this country, who say to their students in the class, when I did this course, I got 70% when I was an undergraduate. Therefore, it is impossible for any student to get more than 70%, because that will mean that you are cleverer than me. This is real. That's a real example that I've just given. We really have to start questioning these kind of attitudes and approaches. I think there are 2 important teaching questions. This is a more general comment rather than the specific problem of the performance of Black students, but I do think they overlap. And the first is this issue of the ubiquitous availability of content knowledge. I teach postgraduate courses at Wits, and I really don't write notes anymore. There's much better material on the internet than what I can put together. There are better materials that I put together. That is the question. What case do you make for asking your students to come? What are the learning intentions that you have for forcing your students to come to your class? I think COVID has raised the question very sharply. Now that we're doing so much online teaching. But it really is a question that we have to engage with. And then the second question is, how do we reasonability that at least one of the reasons for students' poor performance is that we didn't teach them properly. We have to respond to that. It isn't a question that is simply something we sit under a tree and leave there. We really have to respond to that question. And part of it is about engaging with our students on that subject. I just want to give you an example. Don't worry about the detail. This is what I refer to as a competency matrix. So down this side are the course names. This happens to be a civil engineering curriculum. It's an old one. It doesn't look like it's anymore. But here are the courses starting from first year to fourth year. On this side are the competencies that we expect our students to develop. Problem solving, fundamental specialist knowledge, design synthesis, etc. In each of these columns, we identify the competence as beginning, intermediate, and exit. And so as you go down these columns, these ticks move gently towards the right as you go down. By the time you're in fourth year, you're expected to be able to deal with this competence at the exit level. And so what we've done is we've mapped the curriculum. By the way, there's also things like lifelong learning. And when we first introduced this idea, academics said to me, well, I'll have to wait for the student to die to know that my lifelong learning has been successful. Well, no, that's a bit silly. What you want to do is you want to develop the habits of the lifelong learner. So students have to be forced to go into the library, the research project, the idea of thinking, reading, and speaking outside of the discipline is what is the habits of mind of the lifelong learner. Professional ethics practice, etc. So here's an example. You don't have to follow this example, but it's an example of a coherence matrix. But there are particular advantages. It's very technicist. I'm sure the educationalists amongst you will criticize this for being a very technicist approach to curriculum. And indeed it is. But what it does do is it forces a few things. It identifies as a map the learning development of students across the whole curriculum rather than one course at a time. It starts creating a coherence and integration of competence development. And here's the most important benefit that I found is the individual academics become accountable to the community of teachers in the department. So if I receive a group of students and I expect that they know how to write a sentence that has a verb and a noun in it, and I find that most of my students are not able to do that, I can look at the competency matrix in the communication column and identify my academic colleagues who are meant to develop that competence. And then go and have a conversation with them about either you're not doing your job or I am being unrealistic in my expectations. And so you can start holding individual academics accountable for what they do and the way in which they do it. The content knowledge is actually not that important when you think about it, except to introduce the discipline to the students. Yeah. And then, of course, the other benefit is that you can see the expectations of each course. It's clear. You can predict the implications of changes when you make changes to a curriculum. But also when new academics arrive, you have something to say to them in regard to the expectations of the teaching development in that particular course. Just a few thoughts on what I call the second curriculum. This is the learning that happens outside of the formal classes. And this is the stuff that happens, in just by the fact of being at a university. I I think of distance learning as something to be careful of. I worry that online learning is removing us from what I call the community of scholars. I like the idea of looking my students in the eye. I like the idea of them looking me in the eye and recognizing my failures, my weaknesses, but also my strengths and the things that I can help them with. So we need to be careful as we go to too much online learning, that there is something about imbibing the institutional culture when it is positive, that makes for positively engaged graduates. But the second curriculum is influenced by the institutional culture, and all engagements between students and the university influence the learning of our students. So when the cashier at the canteen is rude to one of our students, that's a negative learning opportunity. The way in which the cleaning staff clean the classrooms is part of the learning opportunities of our students. When we expose students to a lab where the equipment is dysfunctional or held together with a piece of wire, that's a negative learning opportunity. We have to think about all of these things. So the maintenance team, the cleaning team, are all people that we should celebrate on the day of our graduations, because they've helped to get those students there, and they've contributed to the learning of those students beyond the classroom, the stuff we did in the classroom. They've developed the institutional attitudes that our students will leave with, in the sense of what constitutes good behavior in social institutions. Yeah, a second curriculum can be directed to enhance learning. It also requires the teaching staff to be aware of the activities and to encourage students to participate. I'll show you how we did that at Sol Plaatje University. Yeah. Of course, the issues can sometimes blend with the first curriculum. So the example I used of students in residence getting lectures outside of their disciplines is an example of the second curriculum. You know, by all means, show a trashy American movie at the residence where there's sufficient sort of karate or murmakar scenes, and the good guy will get the girl at the end. But then have a conversation about the director's attitude towards violence. What point was the director making about women and womanness? Why did the director choose to have black people as the criminals, etc., etc.? By all means, go and have a session in which students listen to rap music. But then do have somebody get up and ask, why are they calling women bitches and what does that mean in the music, etc. So even as we engage with second curriculum issues, the idea of sort of engaging in the world of ideas should also be focused in what our students do in those kind of activities. Just a few questions about the strategic guides at the development of academic of Sol Plaatje University. One of the things we said to ourselves was we first want to be known as a good undergraduate teaching institution. The research will come later. It'll happen in parallel, but perhaps a little bit out of step. But first, we want to be known as a good undergraduate teaching university. I've got research collaborations all over the world. I've visited a number of universities. I've never, ever been to a research-intensive university that neglects its undergraduate teaching. I've never been to such a university. People take teaching seriously at these universities. I have a research relationship at McGill in Canada. Their argument is if we admit a student, it's our duty to ensure that that student passes. McGill, by the way, is I think top 20 in the world. And so I really believe that good, solid research-intensive institutions are founded on an institutional culture that is focused on good teaching. We also took the view that we would not allow bridging of foundation programs. I've never been involved in a conversation about bridging programs and foundation programs. That was not more than what should constitute good teaching anyway. I sometimes believe that bridging and foundation programs are the way in which universities apologize for not being able to teach their students properly. So at Sol Plaatje University, we forbade all bridging of foundation programs. We allowed a higher certificate program, which of course is a real qualification, but there were no bridging programs. And I think as far as I'm aware, up to now, that culture remains. We focused on good teaching, and that was through the development of academic staff. We also held academic staff accountable for poor course pass performance. So if 40% of your class failed, you have to, in the examiner's meeting, get up and explain why that should be. You admitted the students, you decided on the admissions policy within your program. How is it that you allow your students to fail? Or what's gone wrong with that? Of course, the answer, well, if you tell me to, I'll pass the students, is simply disrespectful to your students as well. It also shows a lack of academic integrity on the part of the academic. You're the custodian of quality and standards. You have to make sure that your students rise to that challenge. And then, of course, we wanted to build urban partnerships with urban and provincial ideas that grow research and teaching contributions. So part of the learning was also built into the service learning programs. Our academic policies and practices, we paid a lot of attention to that. I must say, I find universities sometimes that don't seriously pay attention to their policies. I find universities where it is possible to be registered for third-year mathematics when you're also carrying first-year mathematics as a failed course. It just seems incoherent. Our rules were all defensible, academically and pedagogically defensible. So for example, if you set supplementary exams, you have to ask yourself the question, is this a second chance to pass or is it a second chance to learn? Either approach is acceptable, but you have to defend it. But it will also determine what your strategic approach to supplementary exams will be. So for example, if you say it's a second chance to learn, then you can't simply ask the student to come and write a supplementary exam without you having some intervention between the final exam and the supplementary exam. And that level of thinking is necessary in thinking through the academic rules, the academic policies, the progression rules at your university. We also made sure that the SRC participates in the development of all our rules. Students understood the context of the rules and they supported it. We applied the rules consistently, but we always made sure that there was empathy for individual cases. Sometimes things go wrong in students' lives and we have to account for it. We also had a timetable, and I hope they've kept it alive, but there's no formal teaching on a Wednesday afternoon. Academics, this is when students do second curriculum things, public debates, academics give occasional lectures that are for voluntary attendance, sports activities, etc., etc. Public lectures, invited guest lectures, all happen on a Wednesday afternoon. Lectures stop at 5 o'clock on a Friday, but Wednesday is a free day. It seemed to work very well and students responded very well to that. We of course focused teaching development seminars with our staff. We made sure that people understood what was going on in teaching and learning. We were generous in allocating teaching development grants at the school level. And of course, we supported and encouraged participation in national initiatives, including HELTASA initiatives by our staff. All our campus spaces have good quality wireless. We also started the university with the argument that all students should have a laptop. It had bursary implications. We went and spoke to NSFAS and we sorted the problem out because we smoothed the NSFAS book allowance over 3 years, which is, by the way, exactly what NSFAS is deciding to do right now. And in fact, Sol Plaatje University was okay when COVID arrived because we didn't have to worry about laptops. All our students owned them and we helped them to acquire such a thing. We committed to the tutorial-based approach to teaching. It's one approach, one of many, and you can think about that. Excuse me. The library study area is open 24 hours, 7 days a week. I would often get messages from politicians or local senior people in Kimberley saying, we've just driven past the university, it's 2 a.m, your students are studying. What a wonderful thing. And students, especially in the hot summer months, would prefer to actually study in the evening in the library, but it's open all the time and there's proper security as well. And of course, we treated residences as learning spaces. We were very careful with that. And so just a few pictures, just to give you a sense. This is December 2014. The university has already started. The building, the black building, rectangular building in the background is the De Beers diamond sorting building. We were teaching in a building right in front of that, the old National Institute for Higher Education. On the main central campus, this is really just, we're digging the trenches for the foundation. That's the end of 2014, which is the end of the first year of teaching at Sol Plaatje University. For those of you who know Kimberley, this is the old William Prescott building, which is our School of Education. Over there, that's a silver roof. I'll show it to you in a minute. This is November 2017. That's the same. This is the William Prescott High School, old William Prescott High School. These buildings were all built in that 3-year period. It's 1.7 billion rands worth of work there. Not one project late. The library was 2.5% over budget. I was very apologetic, but otherwise everything else in budget without questionable audit issues, etc., etc. That's a science library building, is the most recent one completed. This is our library, won the 2017 Fulton Award for Excellence. Those of you who know the is it the PwC building in Midrand, the Twisted building? No, it's one of the other auditing firms. But that it's got a sort of spiral twisted shape. Well, they came second in 2017. We took the first prize. That's our library. This building is mainly academic building. That building is a residence and teaching building, won a special mention at the World Architecture Awards in Berlin. This is a dedicated building for teacher education. We've got 2 fishbowl classrooms there for teacher education with proper recording and editing services and so on. We think we've made a significant contribution, not only to learning, but also to Kimberley. This is the N12 and this is the N8. So we're sort of right on the intersection of 2 major national roads as well. Yeah. We paid a lot of attention to beautiful spaces. This is the exams hall, which is also a functions hall, but when not, then these are table tennis courts. These are louvers that allow light to come in from the top. And so the place is actually, as you can see, quite beautiful. This is examples of student spaces. We did this very creative thing here. We used these louvers, which protect you against the sun. We cut out using a laser the story of the development of Kimberley. Here you see people arriving. This is the rope metaphor of the big hole. We start with Driekops Eland images from 300 AD. But actually, that's not the artwork. The artwork happens when the sun rises and the shadows travel across campus every day. So the story of the development of Kimberley travels the shadows across the campus. Yeah. Here's an internal residence discussion area. As you can see, we just simply put color in. By the way, it wasn't more expensive. In fact, these louvers were cheaper than the more conventional louvers. So just with a little bit of imagination and creativity, you can actually produce beautiful spaces. This mosaic work on the wall that you see here on the left, sorry, there it is a reproduction of the quartz zeolites that occur in the geology of the Northern Cape. You get those beautiful shades of gray ranging from black to white here. And so we started to stitch that into the architecture. I have no doubt that Sol Plaatje University, by the way, produces some of the best pass rates, and that's not our argument. We still have external examiners who keep an eye on us from outside universities. And we have regular reviews of our programs from outside intellectuals and academics. And we are producing some of the best throughput rates. I have no doubt that the quality of the architecture and the infrastructure contributes to the sense of academic performance that our students are able to achieve. Colleagues, just 40 minutes, and thank you very much. That was, I hope you found that useful. There's a few minutes for questions and comments and criticism. Thank you very much. Over to you. There I am. I hope you're all still there.
We are still here, Prof.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're just waiting for our program director, Prof. Makura, to take over and facilitate the question and answer session. Prof. Makura, over to you.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the wonderful and insightful presentation. We really appreciate those insights. And I'm sure the audience benefited quite a lot. New insights, new epistemologies, and everything that you shared with us. So, ladies and gentlemen, the ball is in your court. Shall we engage Prof with questions, comments, etc. I see in the chat, it's more of praises. I'm trying to look for questions. I'm not seeing any question. Anybody who has got a question, ladies and gentlemen, so that we share? Any volunteer?
Can I ask something?
Yes, go ahead, please. I can't see who it is.
I have put on the chat, Prof mentioned something about in the line of students being given opportunities and so forth. And I have inquired around and I found out that, yes, most universities, we give students second ops, we call them second ops, that's opportunities. And I am puzzled because it's like the student, you didn't make it, but come, here's another chance. Yes, we can do that on cases where a student was sick, where we know that the student is a diligent student and circumstances beyond their control made them not to make it. But you find a student who lies in their residence, who never attend class, who never actually show any interest, having a second chance to pass. We force them to pass and we send them out there. And these are the very students who sit in public and embarrass their professions by making examples that don't make sense. What are we doing as an institution of higher learning? And my point is, we see how our matric results and our matric prowess have been lowered down, 30%, 20%, pass all. And we accept these students in our academia, and we go on. You didn't do well, but come, there's another opportunity. Here's a third one, and here's a certificate. Go out there and mess up. So why are universities doing that? Why are we forcing students to pass?
Okay. Elizabeth, you've raised a few issues. The one is, and I'll this issue of the distinction between a deferred exam and the point I made is develop rules. You have to develop them very carefully, and you have to think about why it is you are offering a student a deferred exam. So if a student was ill or something happened, there was an accident in the taxi on the way to the exam, That's an argument for a deferred exam, and you have to make sure that it's genuine. Somebody has to assess the evidence, and the student must make an appeal. Why are you giving a supplementary exam? That's a different one. So again, you must make the rules. So we, for example, and this is not for a minute saying that you should do that, we would say a supplementary is an opportunity for a student who has otherwise done well, but may have come down on 1 or 2 courses. So in my school at Wits University, you cannot have more than 2 supplementaries. You must pass everything else. You cannot have more than 2 supplementaries. The average for the 2 supplementaries must be more than 40%. So there are strict requirements. If you failed everything, there's no supplementary, even if all of them are 45, etc. So what I'm saying is, I think you need to think carefully through the rules. So the irritation that you speak of in the way in which you're granting second opportunities needs to come out in a conversation with your colleagues about the basis on which we grant supplementary exams. The issue about admissions, why are we admitting these students? Firstly, I am the chairperson of the academic standardization committee, the assessment standardization committee for Umalusi. And in fact, we start standardizing matric results in the near future. But I wanted to make a point. It is incorrect to expect Umalusi or the Department of Basic Education to send us students who are guaranteed to pass. That is unrealistic and it is irrational. We cannot set a matric system in this country that sends students to universities who are guaranteed to pass. Whether or not they will pass is our job. But also, we determine the admissions policy. So if you think that your department or your university is admitting the wrong students, well, that's your admissions policy, not outside. Nobody outside dictated that. So what it sounds to me as though the institution needs a conversation with itself about its admissions policy. But what we can't do is go to Umalusi and say, you must give us students who are guaranteed to pass. No, that's our job. And then just the last point is, if your students are leaving your institution with bad attitudes or improper attitudes in their discipline, then that's a conversation that the university must have with itself. We certainly can't blame our students for that. What they leave with is what they learned at the university. I'm always astounded when I talk to my old graduates, ex-graduates, when they come and they have a chat with me, at what it is they remembered from their lectures. They'll say, Prof, you know, in such and such time you said so and so. I have no idea, I have no recollection that I actually said that. Sometimes, and that is why it is so important that we be careful about the way in which we teach our students. You know, there's a maxim that goes, people rarely remember what you do for them, but they always remember how you made them feel. And as we engage with our students, it really is important that we think about that. Yes, some of them misbehave and some of them are scoundrels and they will, and our institution must be hard on those. Bad intellectual behavior cannot be tolerated. But at the same time, the university should be a place where it is okay to make mistakes. It must be safe to make mistakes. That's why 50% is a pass mark. If we expected more than that, our pass marks would be higher. But it is a place where it's okay to get half of the exam paper wrong. You're not going to do that in the world of work, but yeah, it's okay to make a mistake. Just don't hurt yourself irretrievably. I'm not sure I've answered questions, but it's more comments to your question. Yeah, thank you.
Chair, if you
Thank
allow
you,
me,
Prof.
Can I just clear one thing? Where I come from,
Yes,
we've got lovely policies, and we abide by them. We've got a nice competitive selection criteria too. I'm alluding to the fact that we do have, yes, policies also that speaks to those second ops and so forth. I know they're called supplementary. When I was a student, when I was a young student, many moons ago, I was sick and I had to write the supplementary exam. But I do talk about where students have frivolous reasons why they could not write the first one, or when they failed. And I'm talking particularly also to students who really are not pulling it off, but we as a university family, and I'm not talking about my university, I'm saying in general, that there is that thing that students go, we have seen it, Prof. We've seen somebody talking about fat cake example the other day, somebody saying, please protect me from you, stuff like that, where people are not accountable. These are people who don't attend classes. These are people who get second opportunities to write exams, but they were never there to hear what the lecturer is saying. So I was just talking about those. But like I'm saying, our selection criteria is also quite good. So we do have a good crop of students. But those are some issues that really, as an academia in the whole, we should really address and talk about, and not be emotional about it, and really have well-rounded professionals that we send out.
Excellent. No, you're right. I mean, I excluded a student at Sol Plaatje University. I was quite firm. With exclusions, we were very firm. And the mother arrived with the young man and started shouting at me for excluding her son. And she said, it's your fault that my son failed. So I said, what do you mean? She says, no, your residences are too beautiful and too comfortable. That's why my son failed. I said to her, well, I think you should go and report me to the minister. But you're right, it's a difficult one, but it's walking that delicate road between firmly responding to our students, but also responding to them with empathy. The firm hand is not necessarily the indulgent hand. We don't have to indulge our students, but we have to develop them. Chair, there was a few, I see there's a few questions emerging on the chat.
Yes.
Do you want to pick them up? I'll leave you to tell me which ones to respond to.
Yeah, you can. I see one from Doris Mnengi. Says the issue of, my question is on the issue of avoiding foundation programs. Do you have articulation policy from certificate to bachelor's degree? That's one. Maybe you can just take note of them. Do you have an articulation policy from certificate to bachelor's degree? Then Barbara Jones says, how can academic staff be incentivized to become better and more thoughtful teachers? Incentives there from Barbara Jones. How can academic staff be incentivized to become better and more insightful teachers? I've also a question again from Elizabeth Karim. How do you go about getting a buy-in? I think it's linked to what Barbara is talking about. How do you get a buy-in from academics with respect to vision of Sol Plaatje institutional culture? How do we get a buy-in from academics? Also, Chichima Imane, linked to institutional culture, asks, what is your take on the role of transformed leadership in shaping an institutional culture for ensuring the creation of a conducive learning space, since you indicated that you developed the Sol Plaatje from scratch? So what is your take on transformed leadership? Then I can give you another one from Mudumo Boweni, who says, to what extent should universities respond to the developmental needs of communities where they are located? To what extent should universities respond to development roles, needs of communities from where they are located? Then the last one, sorry for now, from Ati, says, I would like to know a little bit about peer support. You have placed emphasis on building excellent teachers, but what involvement do students have on building themselves? Do you have student support programs?
Okay.
Sorry for skipping one.
No, that's fine.
Washe says, I think you have addressed that one, where in former students who do not pass more than twice advised to consider other courses. What is your take on that from Bo? Thank you, Prof. You can call those 5 or 6.
Okay. You've got 7 minutes to your tea break. I'm going to try to be swift.
Yes. I'm aware of that. I shall still some 5 more minutes for the tea break.
No.
Okay.
The worst thing to do is to keep people from their tea. Let me try.
Yeah, it's engaging, so we appreciate.
On the issue of articulation, yes, indeed, we do. So one of my concerns with academic development programs is that very often they run for 2 years. Students then articulate into the mainstream, fail when they get to the mainstream, and then are sent home with 3 years of debt, usually. And very often the hopes and dreams of a whole village destroyed, not one family. We all know these stories. Students, the village sells cattle so that one student can go to a university. And we put them through this, and in a rural village, they don't know academic program and mainstream program, etc. They say, my child is at Wits, my child is at CUT. And then the child comes home with a matric certificate. The reason that I was happy with the higher certificate, which is the level 5 qualification, is that you leave with a real qualification. But more importantly, we then structured an articulation route into the second year of the BA, which allowed, so we're the first university that took to NSFAS the idea that students should articulate with their NSFAS grants. And NSFAS supported it, because we actually gave you a full credit for the first year. And that's because we structured the higher certificate in a way that developed similar and the same competencies as we do in our first year of the BA program. So the articulation is important. Can I also say this is the first university on the African continent to develop a BSc in data science. It's the only program that I had at Sol Plaatje University where I had more bursaries than I had students. So it's not as though we were offering sort of low-level qualifications. By the way, last year, four of the top universities in the US were having a conversation and decided that undergraduate data science is a good idea and they should introduce it in the US. Well, Sol Plaatje University has already produced 3 crops of graduates. We're about 4 or 5 years ahead of the pack in that regard. So this is not, a sense of sort of a light approach to curriculum. It was also possible to articulate from a higher certificate in ICT, which we didn't offer, but we helped CPUT. We were part of the group that developed the CPUT program. So if we had students from CPUT who finished the higher certificate, they would articulate into the second year of the BSc in data science. So that was an important issue here. How did we incentivize academics, get buy-in? I mean, it's a question of carrots and sticks, but it's also, more importantly, a question of institutional culture. I think the overwhelming influence was that academics found themselves, when they arrived, in a space where their colleagues were taking teaching and learning seriously. The Vice-Chancellor gave a lecture on curriculum twice a year. Staff on a Wednesday afternoon would have conversations about teaching and learning in the department. I encourage the deans and the heads of schools to have these conversations. There were so many conversations going on about teaching and learning. As I say, it became part of the institutional culture that bled from the walls. There was, when you walked into this place, the way in which your colleagues spoke to you over tea was about teaching and learning. It was almost impossible to be dismissive of the teaching and learning needs of our students when you were having a conversation with your colleagues. It wasn't always easy. It did require that the Vice-Chancellor, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor engaged continuously, but it was just, you just kept beating the drum all the time. the teaching and learning noise was so loud that nobody could avoid it. You couldn't hide away in your office as a bad teacher. Well, maybe you could, but we would eventually find you. And somehow or the other, you would have to be held accountable for the quality of your teaching. As I said, also, incentives are important. Give people grants. Not everybody knows how to teach. And the idea that since we've all been victims of teaching at one time in our lives, by that fact alone, we are specialists in teaching is a nonsense idea. And you have to say to people, listen, you have to go and learn how to teach, and here's some money to be able to do that. And the real value is when your students walk across the graduation stage. That's why I've always felt it important that academics attend the graduation of their students. I mean, it's really the moment when all fights are forgotten. All arguments are forgotten. Hands are off all the okapis. All the knives are put down. When you see your students walk across the graduation stage, that really is an important moment. Transformed leadership, hey, Khakits. I don't know what it means to have transformed leadership. I think certainly we don't run our universities in the way that we did 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So leadership in higher education has been transformed. When I look at my fellow vice-chancellors at the time when I sat around that table, there certainly is a lot more progressive and engaged thinking in the way in which we engage with our students than there would have been, say, 20 or 30 years ago. So I do think that leadership has transformed. I'm not convinced that leadership has truly accepted or acknowledged this issue of the importance of directing the institutional culture, and particularly with a focus on teaching and learning. So that may be an area of transformation that we need to pay attention to. And there's no harm in that being, sort of a bottom-up development. But somehow or the other, it was important that the Vice-Chancellor arrived in the residence when a teaching and learning activity or a public lecture was happening. Students took that seriously. They really did enjoy the idea that leadership arrived. One of the things I used to do every year is have myself tested for HIV in public. I would go into the public square of the university, and the Department of Health would set up a testing facility, and I would test myself openly. And students used to see this, and in fact, it encouraged them to go and have themselves tested. So leadership does have an important role to play, and leadership must walk the ramparts of the institution. I'm not sure if I'm contributing to your question about transformed leadership. The issue of development of communities, I mean, Sol Plaatje University was unquestionably developed around the idea of a contribution to the development of the city. In fact, the architecture has public spaces. So you'll be on campus, you wouldn't have passed a security gate, but you'll be on campus in a public area. We also chose, for example, to, retail at universities fail because the customers disappear for 40% of the year. You see what has happened to retail on your campuses now under COVID. There's just no customers. What we decided at Sol Plaatje University was to put the retail on the public face of our campus. It's in our buildings, but the public has access to the retail spaces. So you won't be able to buy alcohol, you won't be able to buy cigarettes, but you'll get a good second-hand bookshop. You'll find a nice 7-Eleven, an IT shop. And by the way, the bookshop will host a public lecture by an author once or twice a year, where the public will come and sit on the grass and listen to an author talking about the book. So that issue of the university as engaged with its community was an essential feature of what we do. And I do think that as universities in South Africa, we haven't got that right. I go to some cities or towns where there's a university, and I'm shocked at the extent to which the town has been allowed to deteriorate with a university in its midst. And if you go to great cities in the world, they have a good university, at least one, if not more than one. Publicly accessible art is a feature of great cities. We designed our university so that there was publicly accessible art on the walls. But also stimulating economic activity, intellectual life of the city should be driven by the university. The city on the evening should come and listen to that wonderful CUT choir, free of charge. Just before you leave work at 4:30, 5 o'clock, there's a choir recital, and at 6 o'clock you're home and you're having dinner with your family. Well, that should be a normal part of university life. So the political, cultural, intellectual life of the city or the town should be influenced by the presence of the university. I have no doubt about that. Peer support, there was a question about peer support. Indeed, we certainly, the SRC, I mean, I put a lot of pressure on the SRC to make sure that student learning was supported. But I didn't expect them to teach. I must say the one place that the SRC were wonderful was on areas of mental health of our students and gender-based violence issues. Every time I found a student who we had to deal with a mental health issue, I would quietly and confidentially have a conversation with an SRC member and say, please keep an eye on the student. I'm holding you accountable. Find somebody who's in that residence. Make sure you report quietly and confidentially when you think that there's a reason for concern. And the most frightening thing is when students hurt themselves and we don't know about it. And that's the other point about our pathology. Our institutions don't know how to hear the cries of our students when they ask for help. You always, whenever there's a mental health issue or a gender-based violence issue, I say to myself, why is it that I wasn't hearing that student? Why is it that the fellow students didn't know, the academics didn't know? And somehow or the other, it's a pathology that we have to engage with. We need to learn to hear the cries for help that our students make. Sometimes we're a little bit too quick to blame them. Young people don't go willingly to drugs or alcohol. There's a push factor there. And sometimes we have to ask ourselves, what are the institutional push factors that alienate young people sufficiently for them to go to these kind of habits? Yeah. Chair, this is a much longer conversation. I've eaten 5 minutes of your tea break and I apologize for that. But maybe there'll be an opportunity for another chat. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.